Welcome everybody to this in the CUGH 2022 Global Leader Interview. We have an outstanding guest today and also an extremely important issue. As we're seeing unfolding right now in Europe, we have a humanitarian crisis with more than 1 million people who have left Ukraine from the fighting that's taking place there. But this is part of a very large issue. For over the last decade, we have seen tragically an increase in the number of people who are fleeing for their lives around the world and often in desperate situations. There's one UN agency, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, has been mandated to take care of them. They've been working extraordinarily hard to do so. And I'm extremely honored and pleased today to have the Assistant Secretary General, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, the UNHCR, Ms. Gillian Triggs, here to talk about these issues and what we can do to get behind the support for refugees and how we can prevent a lot of these tragedies from recurring. Ms. Triggs, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you very much for being here. Let's maybe start with just a little bit about the overview of the refugee crises around the world. Can you give us a global picture of where we stand today, please?
Well, we stand in an unprecedented environment, and perhaps just to give you an illustration, we operate on the basis of declared emergencies, which then give us the procedural basis on which we can offer protection. And this past year, we have 40 emergencies across the globe, 21 of them new. So that is absolutely unprecedented in our work. And we are very conscious now that we've got approximately 84 million people forcibly displaced. And I'm quite sure as I'm speaking, those numbers are significantly going up in the context of Ukraine. So I think to speak about the globe, I think we have some major displacement issues, almost invariably prompted by conflict of one form or another, some of them increasingly directly or indirectly caused by climate change or food insecurity or crime, but one way or the other leading to violence. But we're seeing these numbers in a way that we've never seen before. And we need to find the resources and the political will to resolve these issues, but also, frankly, to find ways to head them off before they get to these dimensions.
It is ironic, isn't it, that UNHCR was created after World War II with a 3-year mandate to take care of the millions displaced from World War II. But here we are 70 years later, and you're dealing with a trajectory and an arc where there's an increasing number of refugees. And I found it interesting that there's more than 82 million refugees, more than half are children. That has to be a particular challenge for UNHCR.
Well, it is, and I'm pleased that you've mentioned that, because we tend to speak a little bit more about asylum seekers, refugees, displaced people, but the harsh reality is that more than half of them are children. And in the context of Afghanistan, and now in the context of Ukraine, women and children are making up overwhelmingly the highest numbers. Afghanistan, it's 80%. But I'm also pleased that you should mention the origins of the Refugee Convention, which of course was 70 years ago. When this was negotiated by 26 countries, there were approximately 2 million so-called displaced people at that time. And the intention was a very short term, would just sort of mop up the numbers, make sure they've got somewhere to go, they'd be safe, they'd have access to housing, to freedom of movement, to jobs, to healthcare, education for children. All of these things were to be resolved in a very short space of time. And here we are 70 years later with numbers that are absolutely incomprehensible.
It is, and it's interesting that driver starting for in World War II, those drivers are not only here today, as you mentioned. So Gillian, we have more than 82 million refugees around the world, a number that's growing. I found it interesting, more than half, and tragic, more than half of those refugees are children. How do we deal with that particular challenge with dealing with children in this unstable environment?
Well, of course, it's desperately sad. The children are bewildered and traumatized. They're out of school. They very often don't return to school as quickly as other children will in conflict situations, and also, despite the significant advances made over recent years for the education of girls, they are the ones now least likely to return to school. So the impact on children is very deep and very likely to be long-lasting. And I've just returned, in fact, from a refugee camp in Tanzania, and children have been there for, well, they're born there, spend their lives there, and even today have almost no prospects of a future. So we are dealing with generations of children who are growing up without education or with very little, and with very little opportunity for work, in a context in which, unlike earlier years, very many of these conflicts are protracted. Most refugees want to go home, but because conflicts are protracted, we could take Syria as an example, with nearly 4 million refugees being hosted in Turkey and others in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, and other parts of the world. The hope was, of course, that they would be able to go home. We're now into the 11th year of that conflict. The children of from Myanmar and Bangladesh, 4 years now, going into the 5th year, they really, it's not possible to go home, so that they are really stuck. They have protection in the countries that are caring for them, Bangladesh, Turkey, and others, but they can't get access to the quality of education or freedom of movement or ability to move on with their lives. So I think these become lost generations of children.
And it was a key point you mentioned, that how young these children are. And we know from a medical perspective that what we do, particularly in the first 5 years of life, has a profound impact on the trajectory of that individual. So it bespeaks to the urgency of dealing with the challenges quickly, so they can get the care and get on with the lives that they need to. Can we speak a minute about the drivers of these refugee crises? What are some of the drivers that are pushing these crises forward and are forcing people to leave countries for fear of their lives?
Well, I think it would be fair to say the immediate cause is conflict, violence. Sometimes, for example, in parts of the Americas, it's crime, it's intimidation. But to look deeper into this, it comes down very often to discrimination, inequality, especially for women, racial, national, ethnic, religious discriminations, old hatreds emerging from ethnic differences, but also, and we must mention now, the impacts of climate change. And just to give an example, in the Sahel, sub-Saharan Africa, Burkina Faso, we know what's going on there, Mali, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger. The drought has meant that the feeding grounds for cattle are not there. Those groups move into arable areas, and then you have intertribal conflict. We've just seen, I think the latest figure, 80,000 people over a week or so, rapidly moving from Cameroon to Chad. Again, the issue is access to water, a clash with fishermen, Arab fishermen in those waters, but then other people wanting to water their cattle coming in, and mass conflict. So there are many causes, and we would like, I think, and we are at UNHCR, moving more to work with development and investment partners to see if we can take investment as a way of resolving some of these inequalities and poverty and lack of access to resources.
I'm glad you mentioned the climate change issue, because the IPCC just came up with their most recent report a few days ago, as you know, and it really raised a red flag. In fact, some of the scientists were saying, we don't need more studies, we need action.
That's right.
And do you think that the really important point you mentioned about climate affecting refugees, affecting security, is that an issue that needs to be brought up more often in the climate discourse and what we need to do about climate change?
Well, we've seen climate causing displacement of people, either within their own countries, which is most often the situation, or eventually across national boundaries to become refugees. We see that as one of the most important emerging issues over the next few years. I think that the more understanding we can have globally about the linkages between forced displacement, refugee status, or internally displaced with climate change and inequality, a disempowerment of peoples, the more we're able to address those root causes. And I think one thing that's at least encouraging is that donor countries, developed countries, are now more and more interested in investing in regions of instability in order to settle populations so that they are not inclined to move on. But that means massive investment in actions to respond to the impact of climate change. And of course, it can be drought in the Sahel, but it can be cyclones and hurricanes in the Americas. It can be flooding, unprecedented flooding. It can be plagues of locusts, all of which are linked in one way or another to climate change. So I think this sort of, I mean, the word the UN speak is intersectionality, but it's a complexity of factors that I think people will understand. But yes, I think we've got so much science on climate change. What we haven't yet done is to translate the impact of climate change into the reality on the ground of how it is in these various ways affecting people's lives and leading to displacement.
I'm glad you brought up that connection between, as a driver of human displacement, that climate change and the Sahel is really one of a number of graphic examples of that I think are largely underappreciated. As a barrister and solicitor and a leader from Australia in protecting people's human rights, you brought up another really important point about protecting refugees, and some of them are subject to a great deal of abuse, either within countries or on the process of leaving. How can we do a better job of protecting those people's lives who are fleeing for their lives, but are often subject to, whether it's overt violence or sexual assault or many other abuses?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is, of course, a primary function of the UN Refugee Agency, essentially protection. But that can be all sorts of things. It can be protection with regard to gender-based violence. Women and children on the move are very, very vulnerable to abuse of various kinds, but of course, sexual abuse. And sadly, there are people watching them to take advantage. They're criminal groups taking advantage and abusing and exploiting women. So we try to provide preventive advice to make sure that women don't fall into the hands of these people, but also psychosocial support afterwards. There are certain groups that always suffer high levels of discrimination, and this is of relevance, of course, to this consortium of universities, and they are people with disabilities. It's a shocking fact that on almost any element that one counts gets data, people with disabilities suffer more than anybody else. So when people with disabilities are trying to move, they're fleeing, they are the ones really very likely to be severely impacted. Another group, sadly, in some cultures more than others, of course, are people with a different sexual orientation or gender identity. So the services we provide are really to address some of those key protection concerns of people who are displaced. They are exceptionally vulnerable. Elderly people unable to move at the speed of others, who get left behind, families separated. These are horrific circumstances. But we also, of course, when things do settle a little, want to be sure that we get children into schools, that there's an equitable access to healthcare services, and then as time goes on, of course, greater access to employment, to livelihood, because one of the solutions, if a refugee or asylum seeker can't go back home, we can hope to enable them to be more self-sufficient. They have access to livelihoods, to be able to contribute to the community. And perhaps it's worth mentioning, and I'm sure you and your members of the consortium will know that asylum seekers and refugees have been very important in fighting COVID, that they've been working, providing care services, working really on the front line of this virus. And I think that's helped a little for communities to understand what a refugee can contribute to the community. They're not just a burden, but they can actually bring all sorts of benefits.
Very, very true. And those countries that have absorbed refugees have really showcased, I think, the importance to others about that value. And just an important point here in North America that people, I think, tend to forget is that more than half of the women fleeing Central America from the violence there moving north have actually been subjected to some sexual violence, which is beyond the pale.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, as a barrister and solicitor, countries do have a legal responsibility to protect refugees within their borders and to accept them. Can you share with us a little bit about the legal structures that obligate states to be able to protect the people who are fleeing for their lives, who are refugees?
Well, as we spoke earlier, the 1951 Refugee Convention is really the foundational document. And it was, of course, agreed very shortly after the end of the Second World War. We had the visionary document of the Charter for the United Nations that was set up in 1945. But within 6 years of that, we've got this remarkable document on the refugee situation. And that document really adopted two principles. One is that every country agreeing to the Refugee Convention would enable an asylum seeker access to its territory in order to make a claim for asylum, which would enable them to be assessed. If they are not in need of international protection, don't meet the refugee definition, then they do not get that protection. The other key principle is that no country may ever return someone to a place of persecution and danger and violence. Now, they're two principles that underlie that legal structure, but the document was actually revolutionary for its time because it did require access to primary education on the same terms as the national community, a right of access to freedom of movement, to earn a livelihood on the same terms and conditions of any other foreigner in the country, access to housing and so on. So it was a very, very important document. And 148 countries at least have now accepted that document, and it has what's called customary law status. In other words, many of its elements, or some of its elements, have customary law, international law obligations. So nations are bound by these principles, particularly the principle so-called of non-refoulement, non-return to violence and danger. But that is an international treaty, and treaties have no impact until the national government enacts that treaty or gives effect to it within their national laws. Yeah. And so Canada, the United States, Germany, Tanzania, China, all of those countries in various ways implement that refugee convention in their own domestic laws. Now, they don't always do so in an effective way, and their policies may vary in relation to those obligations. And that's really the challenge. And in fact, it's the challenge for international law generally. In other words, you can agree a treaty in the international environment with the signing ceremonies and the flowers and the red carpets, but it's very different when you come back to the state, to the country itself. And that's the challenge for the 21st century, I think. And given these numbers with regard to refugees, it's really a challenge for those displaced people.
We have a responsibility to protect, but not an obligation to act. Isn't that the case, unfortunately?
Well, we do have an obligation to act. We have an obligation to give effect to those principles. But I'm afraid there is very little that can force the state to do that if it chooses not to. So we do have, for example, in COVID, many countries closed their borders, and we still have about 48 countries that completely closed their borders to refugees and asylum seekers on the grounds of health. Now we say, and I'd be very interested in the views of your members on this, but what we advocate for protecting borders to manage the pandemic, the health crisis, this and others in the future. But you can also do it in a way which allows access to asylum seekers and to have proper procedures to consider their claims. So it's a question of balance and a question of flexibility to make these principles work.
Which leads to the question is, how do we do a better job of what the country needs to do a better job in terms of repatriating or resettling refugees that are within their borders, and particularly those. I found it interesting that the countries that harbor the largest number of refugees are those that are in low and low middle income countries.
That's right. That is one of the ironies, the sadness of this, that 85% of refugees, asylum seekers, displaced people are actually hosted by the poorest or least developing countries. And that's a shocking phenomenon. And that is why we have the Global Compact on Refugees, in which there is now an acceptance within a non-binding agreement that countries will share equitably the burden and responsibilities for asylum seekers and refugees and IDPs and for stateless people. Now that again has to be implemented into practical terms, but that is the challenge.
And is there a better way? I think we're coming down closer to the bottom of the hour, and I know you have a hard stop, and I want to make sure we give enough time to any other points, Gillian, you'd like to make. But are there other things we could be doing to have a more effective warning system with regard to the drivers that can start to go down a very bad road that would start a process that would force people to leave their countries? Do we have is there a better early warning system that's needed?
Look, that's a really important question, because one, we want to deal with root causes through development, investment, and so on. But why are we taken surprised by these things? You know, why suddenly do we have this conflict in Cameroon so that people are moving across into Chad in such big numbers? Why were we not better prepared for Afghanistan or Myanmar or now Ukraine? I can say that in the Sahel, there's some very interesting work going on what's called predictive analytics. And that is a mechanism of using data to start to determine what the likely outcomes of that data and analysis is going to be, so that we're better able to be prepared. I think we'll see developments in that way. We are getting better global data, and we are getting a better ability to analyze, but I think we have a very long way to go. It's a relatively new field. I mean, some things are sort of common sense. You can see forces gathering at a border. It doesn't take a great leap of imagination. So of course we've had all sorts of contingency plans in place and are now able to act on them. But others are, one might say that a conflict over resources was obvious in Cameroon along the river region. But then you have peace for decades. Why suddenly does it lead to a conflagration? We're not very good at trying to understand this. And so your question's a good one, but I don't have a very good answer for the moment. But I think we're more aware of the need, one, for prevention mechanisms, but two, predictive ways of enabling us to have better contingency planning.
And an important challenge for the future for us all to work on and find ways to contribute to that important effort. Finally, can you share with us the things that we as a large international global health community can get behind to support UNHCR, not only this time, but looking forward in terms of reducing the drivers of human displacement? What can the international community do a better job to support your work and also prevent these human tragedies?
Well, thank you. I mean, what we try to do is to find solutions. We're a very practical humanitarian, non-political body. And the solutions historically have been resettlement, but numbers are tiny. It's less than 1% of those in need of resettlement ever get it. So it's tiny. It's not a long-term solution for the overwhelming majority. Voluntary returns to the country of origin is, of course, an ideal solution, but it's one, because of protracted conflicts, they're proving increasingly difficult to find. The one that we think is, at least for the present, the most viable solution lies in integration, in inclusion, and healthcare services would be the major one. In other words, if we can have advocacy from members of this consortium in the communities in which they work to ensure that refugees and asylum seekers are always included in the provision of those services. I think that's, so advocacy and then financial support to ensure that that can happen are really key, most particularly in the health area, but also in access to jobs, education, housing, freedom of movement. Then they can become self-sufficient and work within their communities. We see that really as being the most sustainable long-term solution, even though, of course, for many governments, they hang on to the idea that the refugee will return home. And we hope they will. But the truth at the moment is that not many of them do. Sometimes they do. In some countries they do. but many of these are protracted conflicts, and we don't see a solution. So I think inclusion is the answer. And perhaps I could say that the COVID pandemic has, in a sense, really exposed the fact that you cannot provide health services to only certain groups in your community. They have to go to everybody. If a refugee community doesn't have the vaccines, that's going to endanger everybody else. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you this. So I think what it's done is to say we cannot deny the access to good services, good health services, on the basis of your legal status or identity. They must be non-discriminatory access for everybody if we're ever to manage these likely future pandemics.
And the people who are refugees are us. They're just like us. They're
Exactly.
no from us, and they're human lives who have been displaced through absolutely no fault of their own. Assistant Secretary General Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the UN Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, thank you for sharing us what we need to do to prevent, detect, respond, and help to care for those people who are displaced through no fault of their own, and enable them to be able to lead the lives that they and we all would like to lead. And I think an important point is they have skills. The people who are in camps have skills. They can use them. They need to give opportunities to do them. And as we started at the beginning, more than half of these people are children, and the failure to act in helping those children lead and have their needs met will lead to lost generations, and that is an immoral situation for us to be in. So, Gillian, thank you for your time. We've heard your message, and we will take this around the world. So again, thank you for your time, and good luck in the work that you and your great teams are doing at UNHCR.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to the consortium. So it's a great opportunity to explain what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.